A Process of Elimination, written by the Seven Saviors. Prologue, The Exam. It all started with a vision. Upon nearly failing the entrance exam to get into Celestia's prestigious school for gifted unicorns, the sound of an explosion ripped through the air and triggered something within me. Before I even knew what was happening, my horn had blazed to life with a violent burst of power, and my world had reduced to white-hot agony. And I doubt I'll ever know for sure, but for me, this is where it all began. As I floated there, writhing in pain from the intensity of the magical feedback, I began to see visions of all the ponies in the classroom, the other CSGU hopefuls, the staff overlooking the exam, my parents, the princess and her royal guard. I saw each and every one of them burn away in the arcane fire of my own magical backlash. One by one, they were burned to ash. They screamed, they tried to run, they scrambled away, they covered their faces, but none of them could escape the eruption of raw arcane power. I think it was the looks of horror that stuck out to me the most. In any case, they all died, and the strangest thing happened in that moment as they burned away, and as I continued emitting deadly waves of mana, as the school was inevitably destroyed along with the entire street, the city beyond, and eventually the whole mountain was reduced to a pile of so much rubble. I no longer felt any pain. Looking back on it, maybe I had snapped from the agony and despair. Maybe some synapses in my brain had gotten twisted in such a way to make me into what I was, what I eventually became. I don't know. What I did know was that when everything finally settled and the princess had finally gotten my magic surge under control, they said I'd been laughing like a filly possessed even as tears spilled down my face. I just kept laughing and laughing and laughing until I passed out. I don't remember that part all that well, but I do remember the vision. Though it had turned out Celestia had made it in time and no pony around me had suffered anything more than some minor scrapes, superficial bruises, and easily reversible transmutation in the case of my parents, that vision stuck with me. Everything was fine in the end. Or so I thought. Not only did I pass the exam, but I became Celestia's personal protege and got my cutie mark in the process. I had even apparently managed to hatch the dragon egg during that exam, something that was supposed to be impossible. I had also somehow made it rapidly grow well into adulthood, much to my own shock. Thankfully, Celestia had managed to fix that as well, and the dragon was reverted back to a mere newborn drake. I didn't hear about any of this until I woke up in a hospital bed in Canterlot General. I, of course, told the doctors, my parents, and Celestia about the vision, and they all deduced it that I'd simply been traumatized by the experience. Maybe I was. But the strange thing was that at the time, I didn't feel like that was the case. After all was said and done, I felt completely fine, yet at the same time, I knew, maybe instinctively, but I knew something had changed. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't fully register it. When I thought back on my vision, it wasn't with any sort of fear or shaking or crying or anything like that. No. The reason I had unconsciously known something was wrong was because every time I thought back on that vision of death and destruction, it was with a strange sort of relish. I didn't realize that was what I was feeling back then, and had I realized that was the case, maybe I would have told Celestia and the others. Maybe then I wouldn't have gone down this dark and gruesome path I trotted, but it's too late for that now. I can't turn back the hooves of time. In any case, it was this sense of wrongness that caused me to reject Celestia's offer to raise the baby dragon I had hatched. Normally I would have jumped to take the offer. It was Princess Celestia who had asked after all. The thing was, when she showed me that dragon, showed me how innocent and helpless he was, I began to get scared. I couldn't figure out why, but I started shaking and my heart started pounding in my chest. It was like something in me was rejecting the dragon and thought, maybe I'm just more scared of dragons than I had realized. But no, that wasn't the case. Either way, I refused, more adamantly than strictly necessary, I might add. The offer to raise the dragon right then and there, much to Celestia's shock and disappointment. I hated myself for the look she gave me, but my mind was already made up. She put the dragon in some pony else's care, and that was that. I never saw him again, and to this day, I still have no idea who raised him. It was the right decision, as I had eventually come to find out, and I was glad for it. Things settled down after that for the most part. I stayed in the hospital for another few weeks or so, while the doctors did some more thaumatological, mental, and physical testing to make sure I was completely healthy. Apparently they hadn't found anything too strange other than an abnormally high magical capability. Nevertheless, they still had me come in once every month for therapy after I'd left due to my experience. Once I was released, I spent a few more weeks with my family before finally moving into the castle. I was a bit confused by the change, but apparently being the princess's protege meant I got my own room and board within the very walls of Canterlot Castle. It was something to do with the princess being able to more easily manage her busy schedule if I was nearby. Something I should probably mention was that before I came to the castle, way back when I was still in the hospital in fact, I started to have strange dreams. I never remembered the content of these dreams, but every time I woke up, I felt a strange mix of horror and excitement. I never told any pony about the dreams, mostly because I couldn't ever remember them, but they continued on after I left the hospital. They continued to happen on and off at home, and they carried over when I moved to the castle. The only reason I had decided these dreams were strange was because of how they made me feel afterwards. Had I known just what I'd been dreaming about, I would have probably been more horrified than excited. Or maybe not, now that I think about it. In any case, this wouldn't become an issue until a bit later, after I'd been living at the castle for a while. Despite all the weirdness and supposed trauma I went through, I was happy. I had shot straight past my dream of getting into Celestia's school for gifted unicorns, and had gained the miraculous honor of being tutored by Celestia herself. It really was an impossible dream come true, and for the first few days I lived in the castle, I could hardly believe all of it was real. Unfortunately, reality had made itself all too apparent soon enough, and I quickly found myself crashing headfirst into it. With my new life in the castle, I had thought all my problems were over, only to realize that they hadn't even begun. My name is Twilight Sparkle, and what you are about to read is an account of my life, my sins, my rise as Celestia's golden filly, and my fall into madness and depravity as this sickness slowly takes hold of me. Celestia, I know I don't deserve it, but please, forgive me for what I've done. Please. Chapter 1. The Strange Guard. Act 1. Foalhood. My first week living in the castle had its ups and downs, but all in all, I couldn't say it wasn't interesting. The princess had wanted me to get acclimated to castle living before she started my lessons, and to that end, I had spent most of that first week simply wandering around and getting familiar with many of the different areas of the castle and getting to know some of the castle staff. Princess Celestia had put me under the care of one of the castle guard, a stoic-looking Pegasus mare with a deep red coat by the name of Crimson Storm. At the time, I thought the name was both odd for a mare and a little on the nose given her coat color, but I didn't outwardly say anything about it. As we were introduced, I smiled up at the mare with my friendliest grin, trying to put my best foot forward. I wanted to get along with Everypony, sure, but more important than that, the princess was watching. Hi there, my name's Twilight Sparkle. I greeted cheerfully as we stood on either side of the doorway to my then new bedroom in the castle's residential wing. The princess said you were the one that was gonna show me around the castle? In response, the tall and rather lean mare just stared at me with impassive gold-yellow eyes, and my bright smile slowly slipped from my face as I waited for an answer. Eventually, I turned back to Celestia, whom I'd been conversing with about my extended stay here in the castle. She sat near the desk that had been set up for me in the room, and my nervous expression turned to one of bemusement when I saw she was not looking at me, but at the golden-armored mare in the doorway. She tilted her head slightly with a questioning raise of her brow. Before I could make sense of it, I heard a small cough and turned back to the guard. She had that same impassive expression, but this time she spoke, her voice both surprisingly deep and surprisingly quiet. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Twilight Sparkle," she said in a rather flat and uncomfortable tone, as though she wasn't used to speaking in general. "The name's Crimson Storm, and yes, I'll be showing you around the castle, for the time being." Yeah? I replied, caught off guard and now just as uncomfortable in the rather awkward atmosphere. "Thanks, and, I once again looked to Celestia for help, and she chuckled before giving me a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Twilight," she replied, nodding towards the soft-spoken mare. "She may look rough and tumble, but she's actually a bit shy and doesn't speak much. Believe it or not, she was actually the one who volunteered to show you around. Isn't that right, Storm?" "As you say, Your Highness," Crimson Storm replied with a curt nod. "I've been told more than once that I need to learn to communicate more." I took another look at Crimson Storm, trying to gauge her true feelings on the matter, which itself was not an easy feat. The mare's face was a mask of stone, and in the end, I couldn't discern anything from her. Apparently that wasn't the case with Celestia. "I understand this isn't exactly what you expected when you asked me for help, Crimson Storm," Celestia said, as though reading the mare's mind. "But I believe you may just gain more out of this venture than you realize." I gave the princess another bemused frown, one she returned with a mysterious smile. This had been the first time I'd seen her wear that kind of smile, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time. I would come to learn that whenever she wore that smile, life would always get a bit more interesting for me. In any case, I turned back to Crimson Storm, determined to try my hoof at another, more successful introduction, but the mare had already stepped away and began trotting down the large hall. "What? Hey, wait!" I cried out, scrambling after the mare. "Wait for me!" I stopped and turned at the sound of Celestia's laughter. "Be patient with her, Twilight," the princess said with a small smirk. "She can be a bit difficult to deal with, but she really is a good mare beneath all the hard-faced stoicism." I didn't quite see it at the time, but I nodded anyway and hurried after the Pegasus guard. She had already gained a good bit of ground when I was speaking to Celestia and had to gallop a bit to catch up. I dodged out of the way of the other castle staff, wandering the halls of the castle as I made my way to Crimson Storm. Eventually, I managed to catch up and frowned up at the mare, who had finally noticed I wasn't following and slowed her pace somewhat. "Sorry, I thought you were right behind me." "What? No, I wasn't," I replied incredulously. "You never even said you were leaving. You didn't look back. You just left." Crimson Storm said nothing in response, merely glancing at me sideways for a moment before shifting her wings slightly and looking ahead. My own petulant frown deepened, and I went to complain again, but then I remembered Celestia's words and let out a grumpy, resigned huff instead. "Okay, let's start over," I said, forcing a smile. "My name's Twilight Sparkle. It's nice to meet you, Crimson Storm." I held out a hoof for her to shake, but she stopped and merely looked at me. She blinked once, and I could just make out a slight frown of confusion. "We already met in your room," Crimson Storm replied flatly. "Why introduce yourself again when I already know who you are?" My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Even as an 8-year-old filly, the mare's complete non-understanding of social cues had left me speechless. I mean, we really didn't really, I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling an odd mix of irritation and embarrassment. When we introduced ourselves before, it didn't really go the way I wanted. It was then that I remembered that. While I was nowhere near as bad at social interaction as Crimson Storm seemed to be, I wasn't exactly a social butterfly myself, having spent most of my time before moving to the castle indoors studying. Sure, I had a friend or two, but I rarely hung out with them, and the other fools my age may as well have been grass on the side of the road for all the attention I paid them. Then there was Crimson Storm. She was a full-grown mare in Celestia's royal guard, and she was even worse at talking to ponies than I was. I found the whole idea incredibly odd and a little creepy for some reason.
I see.
The mare finally replied tonelessly.
I'm sorry to hear that.
With nothing more than that, she began briskly trotting down the corridor again. I gave a half sigh, half groan, as I followed after her. It looked like Celestia was right about the mare, and I wasn't going to get through to her so easily. Where are we going? I chose to ask instead. What's our first stop?
Kitchen.
Crimson Storm replied.
Then the Great Hall.
Honestly, that was fine with me. It had been a little more than a few hours since I had eaten breakfast, and I was starting to get hungry again. Of course, this was all assuming Crimson Storm was going to the kitchen to get something to eat.
I skipped over lunch to come see you.
Crimson Storm replied when I asked her as much.
I've decided to get something to eat while showing you both the kitchen and the Great Hall.
Oh, okay, I replied, nodding in understanding. I guess that makes sense. And so we continued onward towards the kitchen. We moved past a host of maids, guards, and the general public that had been waiting on Celestia to finish her break and return to the throne room for day court. On the way, I began to notice something odd. As I trotted after Crimson Storm, I started to hear various whispers and mutters from passers-by. My ears perked up, and I cast a curious glance around. A few mares and stallions had stopped a little ways behind, and I noticed with some apprehension that they were all casting furtive glances in my direction. In trying to avoid their gazes, my eyes were instead drawn towards a lavishly dressed earth pony stallion and a unicorn mare wearing some sort of fancy-frilled dress, as they spoke in hushed tones.
Filly from the exam? Yes, indeed. Nearly destroyed the entire school and every pony in it from what I heard. Turned our own parents into plants and summoned a full-grown dragon big enough to break through the ceiling. The expenses to reverse the damage must be immense. And the bits are no doubt going to come out of our pockets. How dreadful! And to think the princess is letting her stay here in the castle. What on Aquis is she thinking? Honestly. It does boggle the mind to think that our fair princess would put all our lives in danger like that. Such an unstable child should be kept away from the masses, or at the very least, from the castle.
Their voices weren't as quiet as they seemed to believe, and I heard every word. The conversation came to an abrupt halt as the stallion's eyes finally wandered over to the very filly they had been discussing. His own eyes widened as he saw me standing there staring back with my mouth hanging slightly open. He nudged the mare he had been talking to and nodded towards me, causing the mare to also look in my direction. The mare's face as she noticed me was the very picture of disdain, the expression so caustic that I winced and looked away, my ears folding back in shame and embarrassment. I looked back just in time to see the mare open her mouth, no doubt to shoot some kind of scathing remark my way. The stallion, however, put a hoof on her shoulder and she turned back to him with an irritated scowl. He in turn simply shook his head and ushered away. The mare made to argue, but seemed to decide against it and followed after the stallion, but not before throwing one last scowl my way. Mercifully, the others who'd stopped to stare and whisper had also decided to clear out one by one. Soon enough, Crimson Storm and I were once again left alone as the last of the onlookers returned to what they were doing or moved on to wherever they were going. I watched them all go for a moment before sinking to my haunches. Up until that point, I hadn't even considered the consequences of what I had done that day. I really had nearly destroyed the school, But all I cared about then was the fact that I had gotten my cutie mark and became Celestia's personal student. I was so happy. The fact that so many ponies might have died if Celestia hadn't intervened when she did never once crossed my mind. Well, it had, but not in the way that it should have. Thinking about it then, it still hadn't really. Sure, I did feel guilty that I hadn't once given any thought to how my actions had affected others, had affected my own parents, but even when I thought back to my vision, all those ponies being reduced to ash and scattered away along with the school and the rest of Canterlot, I wanted to laugh. I wanted to laugh like I supposedly did back then, and that alone caused me to shiver slightly. It wasn't like I didn't know right from wrong, and I knew intellectually that such a thing would be a tragedy, but I couldn't help what I felt. Maybe that wealthy stallion was right. Maybe I did need to be kept away from the other ponies like some sort of freak. I would have continued to sit there in the middle of the corridor feeling sorry for myself had it not been for a strong hoof on my own shoulder. I looked up, eyes full of unshed tears, to see Crimson Storm gazing past me and towards the direction of where the two noble ponies had left. To my surprise, her eyes were narrowed slightly in disgust, and there was a deep scowl on her face.
Trash.
I blinked, completely taken aback by the sheer amount of venom the mare managed to pump into that one word. It was to the point that I forgot my own sorrow in favor of sudden curiosity. Did Crimson Storm hate the nobility? My question of course went unanswered, but with that one word, Crimson had lifted my mood, if only slightly. It wasn't that I myself hated the nobility. I honestly had no real opinion of them despite what had just happened. But it was just nice to know some pony was on my side. Maybe. She hadn't really agreed or disagreed with them, and the look on her face didn't really give anything away either. What did convince me was that she might be on my side after all what she said next.
Don't let them get to you.
Crimson said, her tone neither reassuring or comforting, and her expression as stony as ever.
They treat every pony that isn't noble like scum. You'll get used to it.
With that, she gave me an awkward pat on the back and continued towards the kitchen. I looked after Crimson Storm a moment before wiping my eyes, letting a small smile cross my muzzle and trotting after her. It wasn't exactly an uplifting speech, but at the very least, the mare's words managed to lift my spirits somewhat. It was the intent that mattered, and it was something I was able to acknowledge and appreciate, even as a filly. We eventually reached the kitchen, and much to my surprise and the head chef's irritation, Crimson Storm piled a mountain of food onto a tray while she mostly let the kitchen staff show me around. We headed back out and towards the Great Hall, the Pegasus guard with a large stack of several vegetable dishes atop her back, and myself holding a more modest tray of carrot soup, a few sticks of celery, and some seasoned bread in my magic. As we both entered the Great Hall, I could see a few more guards eating and chatting at one of the two lengthy tables that took up a large amount of space. I tried to start some small talk on the way to the hall, but hadn't managed to get much out of Crimson Storm other than a few muttered and mumbled one-word answers and short, curt sentences. I wouldn't give up though, and as we made our way to one of the tables, I resolved to get Crimson Storm to open up one way or another. With my mind so focused on the difficult task ahead, I had almost completely forgotten about the incident with the two noble ponies. Almost. Chapter 2. The Captain. I didn't remember much of the tour around the castle, truth be told, but there were a few things I did remember about that day. Two instances in particular stuck out in my mind. One of them involved a conversation I had with Crimson Storm, and the second involved a meeting with the captain of the Royal Guard at the time. The first instance was when we sat down to have lunch in the Great Hall. By the time we'd gotten there, most of the other ponies, many of them other royal guards, like Crimson Storm, had already finished eating, and the hall was fairly empty. Crimson Storm had removed her helmet, and much to my amusement, her mane was cut in a similar fashion to my own. Both her mane and tail were pale gray, and both were cut and even at the end like mine were. The only difference aside from the color were that both hung down lower, with the flat bangs of her mane falling past her brows and partially into her eyes. While the similarity was interesting, that's not what I wanted to focus on. My focus was to get Crimson to open up and tell me about herself. Back then, I had no idea why this was so important, especially considering I didn't really enjoy communicating with others. Part of me wants to say it was because I wanted to impress Celestia for whatever inane reason, but in truth, it was something about that mare in particular. There was something that drew me to Crimson Storm, and for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what it was. Whatever the case, I didn't want to push her away, so I remained silent for a good portion of the meal. I used the quiet moment to think of something to say and how to word it in such a way that I could get the response I wanted. I continued to drink my soup as I cast conspicuous glances in her direction, trying to gauge her mood. Even when she was eating, she gave nothing away. Aside from the fact that she was a surprisingly sloppy eater, that is, I had spent all of maybe an hour and a half in Crimson Storm's company, and in that time, I'd realized there was nothing I could think to say that would have caught the mare's interest. Then, by chance, my eyes fell on the golden helmet resting on the table next to her, and that's when I got an idea. Hey, Crimson Storm? I asked innocently. She didn't respond verbally, but she did glance in my direction as she wore off another piece of seasoned bread, and I took that as my cue to continue. How long have you been in the Royal Guard? There was no answer for a long moment, as Crimson Storm continued to silently chew on her bread. She swallowed a few moments later and reached for the alfalfa crisps before stopping suddenly. Her hoof hovered over the food. For the first time since I'd seen her, she looked thoughtful. A second later, she slowly grabbed a hoofful of the crisps as she spoke, her tone almost wistful. Years, she replied dully. I frowned, thinking that was all I was going to get out of her, but then she continued. It's been 4 years, 3 months, 4 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 25 seconds since I joined the Royal Guard. I blinked in surprise, my mouth hanging slightly open at the unexpected answer. I was somewhat known for being quite an organized filly for my age, but even I couldn't hold a candle to that kind of record-keeping, and it was all from memory. I was more than a little impressed, to say the least. Wow, I nearly whispered, my smile growing wide. You remember right down to the second? That's amazing. I have a very good memory. I'll say, I replied with an impressed nod. Upon seeing the mare shrug and dig back into her food, I quickly searched my mind for anything else to talk about. Why did you join the guard anyway? Crimson stopped eating again and turned to face me. I couldn't read the look on her face, but for some reason, it felt like she was looking into me rather than at me. This continued long enough that I began to feel uncomfortable. Just when I was about to say something, she finally spoke. There was something that I wanted. She answered slowly before turning back around and staring at her plate. She went quiet again, seemingly lost in thought. Then, something I've been searching for, but even after all these years, I still haven't found it. And what is it? I asked curiously. What were you looking for? More silence. Crimson Storm? I don't know. I furrowed my brow in bemusement, wondering just what the mare was talking about. How could she not know what she was looking for after so many years? It didn't make any sense to me, and I was about to say as much, but then she suddenly stood up, placed her helmet back on, and began trotting away, leaving her unfinished meal behind her. Hey, wait! I called out, quickly polishing off my own soup before hopping off the table and scurrying after the mare. Stop doing that! Wait for me! Thankfully, she stopped this time around, and I didn't have to gallop after her again. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to just leave our food there, but it didn't look like Crimson was going back, so I reluctantly moved on, following behind her as we continued the tour. Nothing of note really happened for the next couple of hours or so. I tried talking to Crimson Storm again, but she no longer wanted to talk, only speaking when she had to and saying nothing more about herself. I started to get the impression that she was upset with me, but I couldn't tell because she wore the same blank-faced expression as always. I decided to stop trying for the moment nevertheless, and together, we both trotted the halls in silence. I ended up learning more from other ponies who worked in the castle, or just from ponies who had been around the castle enough to know their way around, rather than Crimson Storm herself. More often than not, the mare would simply stand off to the side, only giving the occasional one-word comment. As the day wore on and we saw more and more of the castle, my attention moved further away from Crimson Storm and more towards the ponies around us. Everywhere we went, I began to notice the strange, almost worried looks we were receiving. It made me remember the nobles, and I started to get more self-conscious, sidling closer to Crimson Storm almost subconsciously. At first, I thought it was because of what those nobles had said about me and what I had caused at the school. And maybe to an extent, that was what it was. Then I noticed that some of those looks weren't directed at me at all, but rather the pony I was traveling with. I looked from them to Crimson Storm and back. The red mare didn't seem to notice their gazes, or if she did, she completely ignored them. I, however, couldn't ignore it, as it wasn't just the looks. For all the looks I myself got, many of the ponies we stopped to talk to were generally pretty friendly towards me. I was happy for it, and maybe because I was genuinely interested in getting the lay of the castle. I didn't realize it at the time, but when I went out of my way to pay attention to how other ponies treated Crimson Storm, I could see it. Other ponies either completely ignored her, or would subtly try to coax me away from her with some kind of distraction. No pony would actually say anything about her though, and that's what I found so weird. Eventually I decided to ask Crimson Storm what it was all about, and prayed she would answer. "Hey, Crimson Storm?" I asked as we passed through yet another pony-filled corridor. "Are ponies scared of you or something?"
I don't know,
the mare said after a long moment.
Why would they be?
"I don't know," I replied uneasily.
It just seems like a lot of them are trying to avoid you or not talk to you or keep me away from you. I even saw a few ponies run away whenever we got close.
Well, they didn't actually run, so much as they saw Crimson Storm coming and very briskly trotted the other way.
It doesn't look like any pony likes you very much,
I continued, regretting the words almost as soon as they had left my mouth.
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with you,
I lied.
But the way the other ponies look at you, well, why don't you ask them then?
Crimson suggested, not looking in my direction.
If you're so worried about it, find out for yourself. Listen to ponies, hear what they have to say, and come to your own conclusions about me.
And with that bit of rather surprising advice, she fell silent. I also fell silent as I mulled over her words. It certainly would make a lot more sense to ask other ponies rather than Crimson herself. The mare wasn't exactly a font of self-awareness, or any kind of real awareness at all if I was being honest. She also wasn't very talkative. She was right though. If I was going to get any kind of information on her, it was going to have to come from the ponies who'd been around her the most. Given her role in the castle, that meant I'd most likely have to talk to the other guards, which was just as well because it was the barracks we were headed to next. Unfortunately, we didn't even make it to the barracks before there was trouble. Just as we were about to exit the castle's main halls and head towards the separate structure housing the guard, 2 more ponies pushed open the double doors leading to the courtyard and the barracks beyond. I scrambled to a stop and scurried off to the side to make way for the 2 ponies coming through. Crimson Storm merely stepped to the side and saluted. I wondered why until I actually got a better look at the 2. Both ponies were wearing armor, but whereas one wore the same standard golden armor as Crimson, the other pony, a larger, older stallion, was wearing much more extravagant gold and violet armor. The large pale-white unicorn stallion looked around briefly before his hard green eyes stopped on me, then Crimson Storm. His eyes narrowed and he gave her an impatient scowl, his strong jaw tightening ever so slightly.
"Ah, Lieutenant Storm," the stallion rumbled. "I understand the princess has given you some time off to escort this."
He cast a quick dismissive glance my way before turning back to Crimson Storm.
"Fool around the castle."
Yes, Captain Blueblood.
Crimson replied flatly, maintaining her salute.
I've been told I need to express myself more, so I spoke to the princess, and she suggested I spend time with the fillies, sir.
"That's so,"
the captain replied, turning back to me with a scrutinizing gaze. Something about the stallion sent chills down my spine, and I took an involuntary step back. The captain snorted, shaking his head and turning back towards Crimson Storm.
"And you didn't think to consult with your captain before agreeing to this little endeavor?"
With all due respect, sir,
Crimson began.
You were off duty at the time, and the princess...
"Excuses,"
Captain Blueblood replied, shaking his head in disappointment.
"Did the thought that you might be needed to attend other, more important duties ever cross your mind?"
He took a step closer to Crimson, his frown deepening.
"I rely on you, Lieutenant. I trust you to get things done, and things get very difficult to manage when you shirk your responsibilities like this. Do you understand?"
The impassive look in Crimson Storm's eyes didn't change, but I could just make out the tightening in her jaw and the sudden stiffness in her posture. For reasons I couldn't fathom at the time, that worried me far more than I thought it should have. Up until that point, it was like nothing really seemed to faze the mare. Not the stares, not the whispers, not my endless questions. Nothing. Well, nothing except for those nobles. Now though, standing before this stallion, she almost seemed scared. I didn't know how I knew back then, but something deep in my gut told me Crimson Storm feared this stallion, and I found myself wanting to know why when she had been so calm and collected before.
Yes, Captain Blueblood, sir.
Crimson Storm replied tonelessly after a moment.
I understand perfectly. I'll be sure to make you aware before I make any decisions that will interfere with my duties.
The captain eyed Crimson for another few seconds or so before giving a slow nod of satisfaction.
"Good,"
he replied, smiling ever so slightly. He gave a sharp flick of his immaculately groomed golden tail and trotted past the mare. Stopping a little ways ahead, he turned to look back at her from over his shoulder.
"Come with me, Crimson Storm. I have a task for you."
But, sir, the filly.
Crimson Storm started, sounding taken aback for the first time since I'd met her.
The princess already tasked me with...
"Never mind that,"
Blueblood interjected with an airy wave of his hoof.
"Private Bulwark was just about to finish his shift for the day, so he can take care of the foal."
"Wait, what? Me?" came a reedy, incredulous-sounding voice from somewhere behind me. I whipped around to see the other stallion that had come in with the captain standing there looking back at Blueblood, mouth hanging open. But, sir, I already had plans to..."
"To do what, Private?"
Blueblood asked, giving the sputtering earth pony a dangerous look.
"Tell me, what plans could you possibly have had?"
The private took a step back before hanging his head and letting out a quiet sigh. A moment later, he straightened up and snapped a half-hearted salute. "Understood, Captain," I'll see to the full.
Good, Stallion. Now then, the captain replied with another nod.
He switched his gaze over to Crimson Storm, a smile once again adorning his face.
Come along, Lieutenant. You have much to do, and I don't have a lot of time to waste.
I turned to Crimson Storm, silently pleading her not to go with my eyes, but she ignored me. Her expression had once again become that of stone as she looked straight ahead.
As you say, Captain.
With that, she gave another salute and trotted past me without another word. I stood there next to the private, watching as she and Blueblood continued down the corridor. Not once did she look back. Chapter 3. The Prince.
So, I guess it's just you and me, huh?
The private said suddenly. I looked up at the dark green stallion to see him giving me an apologetic, lopsided smile.
You're the filly the princess took in as her student. Twilight Sparkle, right?
I said nothing in response, only nodding shyly. It was as though the whole experience had sucked the motivation to be outgoing right out of me. All that was left now was the socially awkward filly who spent far too much time reading and studying on her own. I looked back over to where Crimson Storm and the captain had gone, but they had already disappeared.
Hey, come on. Don't worry about them,
the stallion said, causing me to turn back to him again. He nodded towards the hall ahead.
The captain may be a bit abrasive, but he is really a good stallion who looks out for his troops.
I didn't believe that for a moment, and I don't think this stallion did either. There was something off about that blue-blood stallion, but I couldn't put my hoof on what it was. All I knew was that he scared Crimson Storm, and he made me feel incredibly uncomfortable.
Anyhow,
the private gave me a friendly smile and held out a hoof.
As you might have already heard from Captain Blueblood, my name's Bulwark. Just Bulwark.
I looked up at the outstretched hoof, then at the stallion himself before slowly raising my own hoof to meet his in a slightly awkward hoof bump.
That a girl,
Bulwark chirped.
Now then, what say we continue that tour, shall we?
He looked around, his smile falling to a bemused frown. Then he lowered his head so that we were eye to eye and whispered,
So, where were you headed again?
I giggled despite myself and told Bulwark where Crimson and I had planned to go next. With that, the tour continued, the atmosphere completely different than it was when I was with Crimson Storm. Unlike the silent mare, Bulwark was incredibly friendly and talkative, regaling me with tales of his time in the guard and the overall goings-ons in the castle. It turned out he had only joined the ranks of the guard a month or so ago. I in turn told him about my brother and how he planned to join the guard when he was a bit older. The conversation continued on like this for the next half hour or so as we trotted around the rest of the castle. There hadn't been much left to see by the time Bulwark took over, and we soon wound up back near my room just a few moments before it was time for the princess to lower the sun. I figured now was as good a time as any to start my investigation into what was going on with Crimson Storm. While being with Bulwark proved to be a lot more fun than I had expected, I still couldn't help but wish I had finished the tour with Crimson instead.
Bulwark, can I ask you a question?
I asked as we made our way down the hall towards my bedroom door.
It's about Crimson Storm.
Oh. Looking down at me with a curious raise of his brow. What about her? I shuffled my hooves uncomfortably as I tried to think of the best way to word my question.
Well, it's just that I noticed a lot of ponies don't really seem to like her,
I explained.
And I was wondering why. She's kind of quiet, yeah, but she isn't mean or anything. So why do ponies avoid her like that?
Ah, that. Bulwark looked around with a hesitant frown before letting out a quiet, resigned sigh. All right, look. You seem like a nice kid,
But if you want my advice, you should stay away from that mare. But why? I pressed, taking a step forward and frowning at the stallion. Why should I? What did she do? Well, It's not really about what she did, per se, Bulwark replied it reluctantly. It's more you know what, never mind. I really shouldn't say. What? Come on, why can't you tell me? I practically growled, my frustration beginning to boil over. Why should I stay away from her? She's not a bad pony, so what's the problem? I'm sorry, kid, Bulwark replied, backing away as he raised a placating hoof. It's not really my place to say. If you want to know more, you're gonna have to ask Crimson yourself. But I already... Look, this is your room, right? He gestured towards the door beside him. Before I could answer, he turned away and looked at me over his shoulder. It was nice meeting you, Twilight, but I gotta go. I wasn't lying when I said I had plans. Wait! I called out as the stallion quickly trotted away. Hang on a minute. I watched him trot ahead and turn a distant corner before letting out an aggravated growl. I stomped my hoof on the ground and telekinetically threw open my bedroom door before storming inside and slamming it shut. Just what was going on? Why wouldn't that stallion tell me what was wrong with Crimson Storm? And why did he ask me not to hang around her? As I threw myself onto my bed in an angry huff, I wondered about it. But at this point, there wasn't much I could do, except for maybe talking to Celestia. It seemed a simple and effective plan, all things considered. I was, after all, the princess's new protege, and I felt that should have allowed me some kind of leverage over the situation. Were it only so simple. Back then, I was a rather meek and by-the-book sort of filly in many cases. But with Celestia, the traits worsened tenfold. I wholly believe my petty concerns to be far below that of Princess Celestia, and so when the thought came to me to ask the princess about it, I immediately scrapped it, not wanting to waste Celestia's time. And so I lie there in my bed, staring up at the ceiling and wondering just what I could do for Crimson. It wasn't quite time for me to turn in just yet, and I found myself with a bit of free time. Now, this normally would have been where I sat or lied down with a good book to read, but I couldn't get Crimson's situation out of my mind. It clawed at me like some gluttonous house pet that hadn't been fed all day. I thought about Crimson and how she acted. I thought about our earlier conversation at breakfast. And I thought about Captain Blueblood.
There was something I wanted. Something I've been searching for. But even after all these years, I still haven't found it.
What had Crimson Storm been searching for? Did it have something to do with Blueblood? Or was I just making connections where there were none? I clenched my teeth and gave another growl of frustration at the whole thing, angry that I was just going around in circles and not coming to any real conclusions. In my irritation, my thoughts turned to the more hard-faced, arrogant captain. What was it about that stallion that put me and Storm on edge like that? Judging by his name, he might have been some kind of nobility, and realizing that brought me to another realization. He was probably some kind of nobility, and Crimson Storm clearly hated the nobility if her earlier reaction to those nobles who'd been talking about me was anything to go by. Could Captain Blueblood be the cause of the hatred? And if so, why? Did Blueblood do something bad to Crimson Storm? At this point, I should have calmed down and thought about this rationally, but I was on a roll, and my thoughts tended to run away with me whenever I was on a roll. Already, I could envision Blueblood doing horrible things to Crimson when no pony was looking. Of course, the horrors I'd conjured up in my mind at the time were just silly full-hood bullying tactics, like calling her names and stealing her food, and getting a gang together so they could rough her up in the courtyard or some such nonsense. I didn't register just how serious a crime something like that last scenario would be, but I was just a filly. I had no idea that far worse things lurked in my subconscious, at least not yet. As it was, I had managed to convince myself that Blueblood was bullying Crimson. Like the fool I was, I decided I needed to do something about it. With that in mind, I began to make plans.
I concocted several harebrained schemes as I lay there, and eventually I pulled open a thick notebook my brother had given me some months back. I had made quite a bit of use of it, especially when I'd been studying for the entrance exam, and I decided that it would serve another purpose here. Within the notebook, I jotted down my various plans to investigate what was happening between Blue Blood and Crimson Storm. It was as I was just finishing marking down the last of my schemes that I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door.
Twilight? Are you still awake? Can I come in?
Celestia's voice floated in through the door, and I blinked in confusion before turning to the large window on the opposite side of the room. As it turned out, I'd been planning and writing long after Celestia had lowered the sun, and I could make out the oddly pockmarked moon sitting high in the sky. I yawned, realizing just how tired I was, then began to panic as I also realized all of my notes were on full display for the princess to see, and I did not want the princess to find out about my little investigation. I quickly snapped the book shut with my magic and shoved it and the quill I was using under the bed before turning back to the door with a wide, nervous grin. I readjusted it to look a little less conspicuous before calling out for Celestia to enter.
Twilight?
Celestia repeated as she opened the door. As she stepped in, she gave me a concerned frown.
Is everything okay? You sound a bit frazzled.
Everything's fine, princess,
I replied a little too quickly.
Nothing's wrong. Just, getting ready for bed.
Celestia's frown deepened, and her gaze intensified. I could practically feel the rattling of my nerves. She clearly wasn't buying it, but thankfully she didn't pursue the matter. Instead, she made her way over to my bed, her warm smile returning a moment later.
So long as everything is well, my faithful student,
she finally replied.
Though, I'm surprised to see you up this late and at your age.
It's fine, princess,
I answered, looking somewhat embarrassed.
I'm used to it. I spent a lot of nights studying for the exam, so this isn't anything new.
Yes, the exam.
Celestia turned away, her features darkening for an instant. A second later, she turned back to me, her worried frown once more in place.
How are you holding up after all this time? You haven't had any flashbacks or anything like that, have you?
No, nothing like that,
I replied, shaking my head.
I actually haven't really thought about it at all since I came here.
That hadn't been a total lie. Up until I overheard those nobles talking about me and what I did at the exam, I hadn't once given any thought to the event, excited as I was to be in the presence of Princess Celestia for such an extended period of time.
Well, that's certainly good to hear,
the princess responded with a light chuckle. She moved closer and set herself next to me on the bed as she continued.
So, how was your tour around the castle with Crimson Storm?
The smile I had managed to pull off fell away completely at the question. I looked down at my hooves and frowned silently before replying a moment later, my tone somewhat quieter.
Crimson Storm is weird,
I answered.
She doesn't talk much, and when she does, some of the things she says are weird. She always has this blank look on her face, and she's just really hard to talk to,
Yes, it is as I said,
Celestia replied with a knowing nod.
She can certainly be difficult to get along with, but surely
I like her though,
I interjected, turning back to the alicorn with a small smile.
I don't know why, but there's just something about Crimson Storm that I like. Yeah, she's weird, but, well...
I tried and failed to come up with a specific reason for my affinity towards the mare, giving Celestia a simple shrug instead.
I don't know.
Celestia stopped and blinked at me in surprise.
Well, I'm glad to hear it,
Celestia finally replied with another chuckle. Her smile dropped suddenly as she continued.
I worry about that mare sometimes, and truth be told, my student, I thought meeting you would be the perfect opportunity for her to open up.
She did,
I replied before frowning slightly.
Well, kinda.
We talked a bit during lunch, but I didn't really learn much about her.
I see. Celestia answered with a thoughtful expression.
Well, lunchtime conversation is a step in the right direction. Give it some time, and I'm sure she'll let you in eventually.
I smiled in response, but my mind was already moving on to the next subject. I didn't want to ask Celestia about Crimson Storm, and from what she was saying, it didn't seem like she knew anything beyond the fact that Crimson had trouble communicating with others. So I asked another question instead.
Princess?
I continued somewhat reluctantly.
There is something else.
Celestia, who had been idly staring out the window in the short silence that followed her earlier statement, turned back to me expectantly.
What is it, Twilight? Did you have another question?
Well,
I shifted uncomfortably before speaking again.
Do you know anything about Captain Blueblood?
Blueblood?
Celestia repeated, caught off guard by the question. She collected herself a short moment later and gave me a quizzical frown before explaining.
Captain Blueblood, or Prince Blueblood VI, is the head of the highest-ranking noble house in Canterlot. His family has served the crown faithfully for generations.
Wait, so he's a prince?
I asked incredulously.
But does that mean he's related to you?
Distantly,
Celestia replied carefully.
His family married into mine centuries ago in a time of political upheaval in order to smooth a few things over. Don't let the title of Prince fool you though, my faithful student. He and the rest of his family hold no actual claim to the throne.
She leaned in close, speaking in a stage whisper.
Though they certainly like to act like they do.
Oh, I replied, not really understanding at all.
So then, how is he a prince?
The title of prince in this instance simply refers to the stallion that holds the most sway over all the noble houses, and Blueblood's family has ruled over the others for generations. I know he joined the ranks of the royal guard in order to follow in his grandfather Blueblood IV's footsteps, and made it to the rank of captain quickly. Though he still maintains his seat as the head of the Blueblood family with his son Blueblood VII as the next in line to inherit the title.
Celestia shook her head, and the quizzical frown returned.
But I believe I've said enough on the matter, and any more would be mere gossip,
she said with a hint of finality.
Tell me, why did you ask about Blueblood of all ponies?
At Celestia's prompt, I pushed my questions about the title of Prince and Celestia's family aside. I made sure not to give any of my suspicions away as I replied.
It wasn't anything important,
I replied with what I hoped was a convincing, innocent smile.
Crimson and I ran into him during our tour, and he seemed interesting, is all. He said he needed Crimson for something, so I had to finish the tour with a pony named Bulwark. He's the one that brought me back here.
It only just hit me then, but I suddenly and finally registered the fact that I was lying to the princess. I was actively and willingly keeping secrets from the millennia-old ruler of Equestria. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I was shocked at myself, as I wasn't really one to lie to any pony. Not like this. Sure, there was an odd foolish fib here and there to try and cover up some small embarrassing mistake I'd made or minor trouble I'd gotten into, but it was never anything serious, and I was never convincing enough to get away with it anyway. Now I was lying about something that could have potentially heavy repercussions, and I wasn't even batting an eye. I was nervous, certainly, but that was simply due to the fear of getting caught in the lie. Not the actual worry that I was lying to Princess Celestia. What was worse was that the sudden revelation did nothing to deter me from pursuing my chosen path of deceit.
Ah, Private Bulwark, was it?
Celestia replied, snapping me out of my thoughts.
A nice enough stallion, I'd say. What did you think of him?
He's fun to talk to, but I kind of wanted to hang out with Crimson more, though,
I answered honestly. I looked up at the princess, my expression turning hopeful, almost pleading.
I'll get to see her again, right?
Of course, Twilight, Celestia laughed. I think it'll be good for the both of you, but right now, I think it's best you turn in for the night. It's getting late, and we have much to do tomorrow. Oh, all right then. I conceded, partially relieved that the conversation had ended. Good night, Princess. Good night, Twilight, Celestia replied, pulling me into a quick but affectionate wing hug. And remember, if you ever have any issues with what happened back then, you can always come to me. I will, I answered, giving Celestia a genuine smile. Thanks, Princess. With that, she rose from the bed, adjusted her wings, gave me one last warm smile, and trotted out of the room. She lit her horn, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. Once she was gone, I got comfortable, lying back against the pillow and pulling the blanket over me. Rather than close my eyes, however, I once again stared at the ceiling with a small frown. My thoughts returned to Blue Blood and the fact that he was not a noble, but the highest-ranking noble in Canterlot. What would some pony like him want with a pony like Crimson Storm? Even more than that, I wondered just how I was going to be able to find out more about the situation. Now that I knew just what kind of pony Blue Blood was, several of the plans I'd made went out the window. After several more minutes of ruminating on another plan of action, I grunted in frustration and gave up, deciding a good night's rest might help smooth out my thoughts. Besides that, I really was tired, and when I finally closed my eyes, I was out in only a few minutes. As usual, I didn't remember much about the dream I had, but this time there were a few details that did stick with me as I awoke the next morning, though I couldn't make any sense of them. What I did know was that the dream involved Crimson Storm, Captain Blue Blood, and a dark room at the bottom of a steep set of stone steps, and something dark red and sticky splattered all over the floor.